Colorless cards have a strange history in Magic. Generally, they're designed to be less efficient generic options for effects usually intended for certain colors. However, thanks to being usable in any color of deck, when colorless cards are good, they're kinda broken. This leaves colorless cards as some of the most polarized cards in the game. So today, we're gonna look at the bottom of the barrel of colorless cards, the kinds you wouldn't be caught dead putting in your deck. Starting us off at number 10, we have Armageddon Clock. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 6. It is the ability's where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you can put a Doom counter on Armageddon Clock. At the beginning of your draw step, Clock deals 1 damage to each player for each Doom counter on the clock. It also has the ability where, for 4 mana, you can remove a Doom counter from Clock. Any player can activate this ability, but only during the upkeep step. Despite its imposing name, Armageddon Clock isn't actually all that threatening. The damage it does can stack up, but it takes such a long time that it's hard to rely on it for much of anything. Even worse, it's completely symmetrical. Clock is best for whoever has the highest life total, slowly draining everyone of their life and pushing those with the least life closer to death. For Clock to benefit you, you have to be ahead on life, and be in a position where you can spend a turn casting Clock and not adding up to the board. In reality, this will usually just result in your opponent taking over the board and hitting you with a large creature, at which point your Clock will actively be working against you. However, in the off chance that you can get Clock into play, and you're in a position where the damage matters, it still isn't good, because Clock gives your opponent an out to itself. If your opponent is ever in a position where the damage would matter, they can just pay 4 mana to remove the counter and stop the damage from happening. Even if it's stacked up a couple of counters, it's not that unlikely for your opponent to be able to pay 8 or so mana to remove all of them, because it takes so long for Clock to come out and start dealing damage. Theoretically, you could use the opportunity of your opponent tapping out to stop Clock to develop your own board. But remember, we're already in Magical Christmas land where your opponent isn't beating you after you paid 6 mana for an artifact that effectively does nothing. In order to get into this situation, you would have to have spent a ton of mana and cards playing removal or other stacks effects to slow them down. The vast majority of the time, Clock is just a dead card in your hand that's more than likely to help your opponent than it is to help you. While we're here, we should talk about Razor Pendulum, a very similar bad card to Clock. This 4 mana artifact has the ability to deal 2 damage to each player with 5 or less life at the end of the turn. If this always dealt 2 damage, it would be very strong in weird, stall, burn decks. However, needing to already drop your opponent to 5 life makes Razor Pendulum pretty useless. The point of these sorts of cards like Pendulum, Armageddon Clock, or even good versions of the effect like Sulfuric Vortex is to play them out early and slowly burn your opponent to death, making the push for lethal a lot easier. However, since you need to deal damage some other way first, Pendulum will very rarely be active and as a result, won't even deal all that much damage. If your opponent is already at 5 or less life, why would you cast Pendulum when you can cast Lava Axe and deal 5 damage to your opponent immediately, and can deal 5 at any point that you draw it, and not when you're already about to win the game? These cards are both bad, and bad for very similar reasons. So it made more sense to talk about them in the same slot rather than have them take 2 different placements on this list. Either way, these cards can at least theoretically end the game, which gives them a theoretical use case that a lot of the other cards in this list don't have. And at number 9, we have Balm of Restoration. This is an artifact for 2 mana. You can pay 1, tap, and sacrifice Balm to either gain 2 life, or prevent the next 2 damage that would be dealt to any target this turn. Now, life gain as an effect gets joked about a lot, as it's usually pretty weak as an effect. That alone makes Balm pretty suspect. But Balm is also a pretty abysmal source of life gain. The damage prevention doesn't really change anything either. The main issue with life gain is that using an entire card to gain life leaves you at a card disadvantage, as well as just wasting mana. If you use your turn gaining life, your opponent can use that turn to play a creature, which will end up doing way more damage than the life you just gained for the same amount of effort. Now, there have been some artifacts that have been used purely to gain life, such as Prism Ring. This is an artifact for 1 mana that lets you choose a color as it enters the field, and whenever you cast a spell of that color, you gain 1 life. This card had a niche back in Standard as part of Mono Blue Prison. This deck used a ton of bounce spells alongside Ring and a ton of draw to make it essentially impossible for your opponent to kill them. Thanks to all their card advantage spells, the deck still had a good late game. Ring could gain you around 10 or so life over the course of the game for only 1 mana, which gave you the opportunity to get to the late game where the deck was essentially unbeatable. Balm of Restoration, on the other hand, only gains you a pitiful 2 life and requires a much bigger mana investment to make use of. The damage prevention is similarly weak. The main use for this is saving a creature from combat or a removal spell. But this isn't likely to work out either. Most colors have way better protection spells to use, a lot of which can be used for things other than protecting a creature from damage. Worst of all though, is that you have to cast this spell and then activate it later, so your opponent knows about it. They're not going to cast their burn spells into your Balm while you have the mana up to just stop it. This is better than not having a way to save your creatures, of course, but a big upside of protection spells is the blowout you get from saving a creature from removal after your opponent committed to casting a spell. Balm of Restoration combines 2 effects that you never want to be cast into one overpriced package. While it's never a completely dead card, it will always never really be doing anything that matters. You'd be better off playing almost anything else instead of Balm, no matter what color of deck you're playing. And at number 8, we have Arcum's Sleigh. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 1. It has the ability where you can pay 2 and tap it to give target creature vigilance until end of turn, meaning it doesn't tap to attack, which is pretty reasonable if not amazing. Unfortunately, the card has the completely unnecessary restriction where you can only activate this if the defending player controls a snow land, and you can also only do this during combat. Snow lands are essentially the exact same as basic lands, except covered in snow. This allows them to make snow mana, which can be used for certain spells and abilities. There are also non-basic snow lands, but they only show up every once in a while. The thing is, there's not really any downside to playing snow basics in your deck, and there are a few upsides to doing so. For an example, if you play a card like Extraplanar Lens, you can exile one of your snow-covered basics to make extra mana with the ability. And if your opponent is playing normal, non-snow basics, they won't benefit from the ability. This has led players to claim that snow-covered basics are strictly better than non-snow basics. And while that might be true, it also just doesn't matter. The upsides of snow-covered lands are so niche that it doesn't matter if you're playing snow lands or not, barring a couple of very specific decks and metagames. The only time players have ever played Snowlands are the few times snow synergies have been strong enough to be meta relevant, which largely hasn't been the case. Combine this with the relatively scarcity of snow basics when compared to normal basics, and the vast majority of players simply play the normal non-snow lands. This, of course, results in Arcum's Sleigh basically never working. We can't even get to discussing the fact that giving a creature vigilance isn't a good enough effect to play a card specifically to give the ability. Most of the time, you won't even be allowed to activate the card, so it'll just be a completely blank card. The only reason that Sleigh isn't higher up on this list is because Snowlands have been played here or there in different times in the game's history. Before Arcum's Astrolabe was banned, Snowlands were pretty common to see, though you still wouldn't have played Sleigh because it just simply wasn't good enough. Still, Sleigh would be fine in, say, a limited format which had us focus on a snow as a mechanic, whereas a lot of the other cards in this list wouldn't even be playable in limited. And at number 7, we have Cyclopean Snare. This is an artifact for 2 mana with the ability where you can pay 3 mana and tap it to tap target creature. Then you return Snare to its owner's hand. Essentially, this is a version of Icy Manipulator, but without any of the things that made Icy Manipulator a good card. Icy is a 4 mana artifact that lets you pay 1 mana and tap it to tap target creature, land, or artifact. Icy is a card that's still playable in Draft in the modern day, but used to be a constructed playable card thanks to its ability to work as a flexible soft removal. Every turn, you could tap your opponent's best creature to prevent it from attacking and blocking that turn, or tap a troublesome artifact with a time-sensitive ability, or tap lands of certain colors to mess with their mana. The most used ability is tapping creatures, as creatures are the most common threat you'll face in a game. A big upside of these tappers, like Manipulator, is that they can easily prevent a creature from attacking for several turns, and then switch to a bigger, scarier creature whenever your opponent casts one. And all while you can play the game mostly normal. Cyclopean Snare fails in all of these situations. In order to tap a creature, you have to spend a grand total of 5 mana. While this is a lot, if Snare lets you pay 3 mana every turn to tap a creature, it would still be worth using in limited. However, bouncing back to your hand and forcing you to pay an additional 2 mana every turn is where the card finally turns from draft playable to pack filler. 5 mana is just too much, mainly because it makes it impossible to use Snare and cast another spell in the same turn cycle. Sure, games of limited go long, but getting over 7 land isn't exactly common in the average format, especially not against anyone trying to build an aggro deck in a draft pod. These aggressive decks are also the matchups where your removal is often the most important. If you try to lean on Snare, what will happen is you'll be able to stop one of your opponent's creatures from attacking, Then they'll play another threat that Snare can't deal with and attack you with that. However, since you're using essentially your entire turn to play and use Snare, you won't be able to adequately respond to their second creature. If you cast something instead of Snare, then the first creature will still be able to attack again, making your Snare basically pointless. The main upside of Snare is that, since it bounces back to your hand over and over, there are potentially some unfair applications of the card with cards that want artifacts to enter the battlefield. You can do some funny things with this in Commander, but it's unfortunately not quite as good as you'd want. Being an artifact prevents it from triggering Cloudstone Curio, the best card for bouncing cards to the hand and playing them again. It also requires infinite mana to activate, so you can't get infinite casts with Omniscience or 2 spells that reduce the cost of artifacts. So Snare isn't good in draft or constructed, and is disappointing in meme decks, leaving it with nothing of note to do anywhere. And at number 6, we have Assembly Hall. This is an artifact for 5 mana. It is the ability where you can pay 4 mana and reveal a creature in your hand. You search your library for a creature with the same name and put it into your hand, then shuffle. There are quite a few overcosted artifacts that let any color draw cards, from the classic James Day Tome to the old Commander staple Mind's Eye. These cards have usually not been great, to put things lightly, simply because paying so much mana to play even more mana later to draw cards is too slow for any format where aggro or even mid-range creature-based strategies exist. If you wanted to play for the long game, you're almost always better off playing color draw effects. Still, these cards are at least usable, and in some cases, they were playable in Commander back when white and red were really lacking in terms of card draw. Assembly Hall can't even really fill that role, however, because of a couple of critical flaws. The first is that the Hall requires not only that you have a card in your hand, but that you have a creature card in hand. So if you're top decking and you have Assembly Hall in play with the mana to activate it, you still won't be able to do anything if you don't draw a creature. This also makes playing with Hall more awkward. If you have a 5 mana creature and Assembly Hall in your hand and 5 mana to spend, which one do you cast? Playing the creature is usually what you would want to do, but if you cast it, you won't be able to draw extra copies of that card later on. The second issue is that it requires you to have multiple copies of the same card in your deck, which is very bad for Commander specifically. Since Commander is a singleton format, if you have a creature in your hand, that's the only copy in your deck. This is pretty rough because tutors are usually at a premium in Commander, and colorless draw spells still have a niche there that they lack in other formats. You could combine with cards like Persistent Petitioners that allow you to have multiple copies of the card in your deck, and that is the best use of the card. But best use doesn't make it a good use. Hall is still a pretty interesting card, and if it did something like add multiple copies of the card to reveal, it would maybe have a niche in joke decks, but as of now, it's simply too expensive and clunky to ever actually cast. And at number 5, we have Aladdin's Ring. This is an artifact for 8 mana with the ability where you can pay 8 mana and tap it to deal 4 damage to any target. Would you like to pay 16 mana to deal 4 damage to something? No? Oh well, then you're probably not going to be surprised to hear that Ring is a terrible card. Dealing 4 damage to anything is a very powerful effect, proven by Flame Lash unironically seen some experimentation back in Standard. Ring is, when you activate it, quite good. The problem is that you'll never actually get to use it. Using it in a fair way as a curve topper that can be used to remove threats and burn your opponent to death is straightforwardly terrible. It simply takes too long to get into play to be worthwhile. However, what makes it go from terrible to unplayable is the fact that once you finally get into play, you can't even use it because it takes up your entire turn to activate. The worst part is that if Ring's ability was just a tap ability or only asked for a couple of mana, it would probably have seen some play with cards like Tinker, which allowed you to cheat it directly onto the field. However, spending 8 mana literally every time you want to activate Ring makes it so that actually using Ring is almost never the right choice. Somehow, cards like Ring have actually seen competitive play though. The card Valakut Invoker is a creature that lets you pay 8 to deal 3 damage to any target. This actually deals less damage than Ring. So why is Invoker seen play? Well, because Walls combos can make infinite mana, and Invoker lets you kill your opponent once you make infinite mana. However, Ring can't be used in this way, because it requires the card to be tapped to activate. If it didn't tap to activate, you could use it as a meme payoff for infinite mana combos, which wouldn't be all that much worse than the next best option of cards like Walking Ballista. But that's not an option for the card either. Once again, we find a card with no viable uses or homes. But at least it's not the worst artifact with Aladdin in its name. And at number 4, we have Obelisk of Undoing. This is an artifact for 1 mana. It has the ability where you can pay 6 mana and tap it to return target permanent you both own and control to your hand. Your first reaction to this card is probably something along the lines of, why would I want to return my own cards to my hand? And while that is a good instinct, Obelisk isn't entirely useless. If your opponent is going to remove one of your cards, returning it to your hand is usually preferable to it going into the graveyard. As we mentioned earlier, there are also cards that trigger when they enter the field or when your other cards enter the field, so you can get value by returning them to your hand. The problem is that Obelisk asks for way too much mana to do this with its tap ability, so it can't be used multiple times per turn. In most cases, you won't even have 6 mana to activate the Obelisk at all, even if you don't spend any other mana that turn. Even if you do have 6 mana lying around, you'll probably want to cast a spell or two, so you'll end up not being able to use Obelisk in response to removal. This absurdly high mana value prevents Obelisk from being used outside of ridiculous combos. However, it's not even good for combos because it's a tap ability. Temur Sabertooth has an ability that returns a creature to your hand and has seen use in some commander decks as a combo piece. However, important to these combos is Sabertooth's ability to be used over and over again. Obelisk would theoretically be able to be used in these combos if it were repeatable, but the value it can generate is tragically limited to its tap requirement. Obelisk is outpaced by other cards at every turn, and is generally far too expensive to actually use. But the fact that it could work as your 15th version of this effect in Zakama deck does prevent it from being higher up on this list. And at number 3, we have Northstar. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 4. It is the ability where you can pay 4 mana and tap it, and the next spell you cast this turn can be cast as though it were mana of any type. So, if you want to cast Progenitus, you can pay any 10 mana as opposed to the very specific colored cost to cast the spell. If you were to rank the power of every effect in Magic, color fixing would be pretty low on the list. Sure, it's very useful to be able to cast your spells in whatever way you want, but most of the time, players are content to let their lands make their mana for them. The main exception to this are when spells are incredibly efficient at letting you fix your mana, and have other benefits on top of doing so, such as Arcum's Astrolabe and Attune with Aether. Northstar, like all the cards on this list, looks at that and says, what if it took the player's entire turn instead? We've talked a lot about how paying so much mana for an effect is too slow against aggro and such, but what makes Northstar special is just how bad the effect it gives you is. A good bar to compare this to is Chromatic Orrery, a card that most players consider pretty weak. This 7 mana artifact passively allows you to spend mana as though it were mana of any color and can be tapped for 5 mana. It also lets you pay 5 and tap it to draw a card for each color amongst the permanents you control. Compared to Northstar, Orrery looks like a staple, passively letting you cast your spells and ramping you at the same time. Costing a bit more to get out doesn't really matter when Northstar would require you to get upwards of 8 lands in play to cast a color fix 4-drop with its ability. Chromatic Lantern is a 3 mana artifact that can be tapped for any color and lets you tap your lands for any color of mana, and is also a card that has never seen competitive play. These cards are popular in casual play, but if you're trying to play optimally, they're completely outclassed by other ramp options. Northstar is a hilariously bad card in a category of cards where the most powerful options are best described as convenient rather than good. And at number 2, we have Aladdin's Lamp. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 10 and the ability where you can pay X and tap it. The next time you would draw a card this turn, instead look at the top X cards of your library and put one of them into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your deck, and X can't be 0. Now, I'm not sure why both of the Aladdin artifacts were so horribly overcosted, but it was bad enough to land both of them on this list. Lamp obviously asked for a ridiculous cost up front, so you would assume that once it's in play, it actually does something worthwhile. Unfortunately, all paying 10 mana does here is give you the opportunity to waste even more of your mana. Actually using Lamp is quite difficult, as you would have to be very careful with how much mana you spend. Whenever you activate Lamp, you can't simply pour all of your mana into it to dig as deep as you want. If you tap out, you won't be able to cast whatever your Lamp actually finds you, unless it's a 0 mana card like Memnite. In practice, you'll have to consider what it is you could draw, figure out how much mana that would cost, and spend whatever is left over on Lamp to dig into your deck. For example, if you were trying to draw an Assassin's Trophy, you would need to have up at least 2 mana. This is quite the balancing act, especially if there isn't exactly one card you're trying to dig for. The end result is that unlike Aladdin's Ring, the ability isn't even somewhat useful once you actually do get Lamp in play. Generally, the best play will just be paying 2 or 3 mana into Lamp during your upkeep and looking a few cards deep for something useful, making it a much worse version of Sylvan Library, or Mirror's Guile, or Geist of the Archives. or any number of other spells that make your draws better. Before we move on, we do need to mention Lamp's first printing. At this time, the way Wizards printed cards made it so they couldn't actually put the number 10 into a mana symbol, as it would have been too large. So instead, they put 2 5-mana symbols in the card's cost, which is as great as it is ridiculous. Basically, Lamp was a mistake through and through. And all the way at number 1, we have Razor Boomerang. This is an artifact equipment with a mana cost of 3. It has an equip cost of 2, and the equipped creature gains the ability to tap and unattach Razor Boomerang, then return Boomerang to its owner's hand. Razor Boomerang then deals 1 damage to any target. So for a grand total of 5 mana and tapping a creature that's not summoning sick, you can ping a single target. Here we have it, the holy grail of overcosted artifacts that do way too little for no reason whatsoever. Razor Boomerang isn't just bad, it's almost ingeniously bad, as the more you think about it, the worse the card gets. It's worth noting explicitly that Razor Boomerang doesn't tap the creature, it gives the creature a tap ability, which changes the way it works with summoning sickness. The creature needs to be able to attack or use tap abilities for Boomerang's ability to be able to activate. So this doesn't let you use creatures that couldn't attack anyway for something else. The card is an equipment, a card type that often struggles to see play thanks to being very reliant on creatures. Razor Boomerang relies on a creature to either ping 1 toughness creatures down or burn your opponent, but neither of those roles really make sense. If your creature is anything better than a 1/1, you'd get more value off of just attacking or blocking in almost any case. Attacking deals more damage than paying 5 mana to bounce your Boomerang around, and blocking is also likely to let you trade more easily. The only time Boomerang is good is when the board is stalled and you can't attack, so you can slowly whittle your opponent's life away by pinging them once a turn during their end step. If you ever don't have a creature, the card is terrible, but unlike other equipment, it won't actually be helping if you equip a creature with the card. Another flaw with Boomerang is that it's technically the Boomerang that deals damage, not the creature it's on. This means that a creature like Niv Mizzet Draco Genius that's equipped with Boomerang won't draw you a card if you use it to ping your opponent, and a Death Touch creature can't snipe your opponent's cards. Now, if you can give Boomerang itself Death Touch, you can get some extra value out of the ability, but there aren't any cards that can give an artifact Death Touch, so you'll have to make it an artifact creature first. So if you activate the ability, then use Sidri Galvanic Genius's abilities to make Boomerang an artifact creature and give the artifact creature both Death Touch and Lifelink, Boomerang will have Death Touch at the time the damage resolves. You do specifically need to activate Sidri in response to activating the creature Boomerang on it, because creatures can't even be equipped to other creatures at any point in the game's rules. So we need to pay the cost of unattaching Boomerang before we turn it into an artifact creature. So by manipulating the stack very carefully, you can kill a 2 toughness creature with Razor Boomerang. Congratulations on your 8 mana 2-card removal spell. Unfortunately, this is the most impressive thing that Razor Boomerang can do. There aren't really any cards that synergize with what Boomerang's doing or practical uses even in low power limited formats. It really seems like the thought process of the card was just, oh hey, that's neat, it's kind of like how a Boomerang works, and they didn't think about how good the card would actually be. Or they knew it was terrible and didn't care, either one. Whatever the origin of the card, it doesn't make it any more castable. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.